Forgotten City, Chapter 4. Dr. Argento was still wearing a suit, but the parts of the body that Kobe could see were only bone. Spindly wrist and hand joints. One foot still wearing a high heeled shoe. Kobe was panting. "It's just a body. It can't hurt you. She's dead." He dropped the newspaper and stood up, eyes glued to the corpse, then backed out of the door. The hospital corridor was empty, with several glass partitions at regular intervals. Trying to forget what he'd seen, Kobe wandered vacantly over the linoleum floor. There were plants there too, but the overgrowth wasn't as dense as in some of the other buildings he'd entered. He guessed it was because the environment in the hospital had been so sterile to start with. Signs above the doors pointed to other departments. Some of the words made no sense to Kobe. Endocrinology, oncology, pediatrics. Dad would know what they mean. Through the glass, he looked into the forested wards. More skeletons lay on rotting beds, not quite as shocking now that he was ready for it. They looked at peace with their sagging nightclothes or moth-eating blankets pulled up to their chests. He'd seen dead bodies before, but never so many in the same place. Like this, they all looked the same. Kobe reached a bank of elevators. Peeling back leaves from a sign attached to the wall, he saw what he was looking for on the second floor: cafeteria. Elevators had long ago ceased to work, as the grid stopped generating power, but he gave the call button a hopeful press anyway, and when it didn't come, he took the stairs. The cafeteria looked like a jungle, the counters and cabinets sprouting giant ferns, tables and chairs like islands of lush shrubs. Kobe heard his dad's voice in his head, making the same joke he always did when they scavenged a restaurant or diner. "The service in here is non existent." "Food's a disappointment, too," muttered Kobe. The menu promised waffles, bacon, eggs done anyway, burgers and hot dogs, fresh fruit salads, and a dozen other things that Kobe had never eaten yet still made his mouth water. But in the kitchen, the only edible remnants he found were canned sweet corn and maple syrup. Better than Bark's dog food, I guess. There was still gas in the pipe, so he sterilized water over the stove, taking some to refill his canteen and enjoying some slightly stale chamomile tea with the rest. By the time he had finished, it was getting late in the afternoon. Getting back to school before dark fell would be possible, if risky, but he hadn't come this far just to turn back. The labs were where his dad had been heading, weren't too far away, maybe 20 blocks or so, if he ever made it there. Kobe pushed the doubts away, but they lurked on the edges of his consciousness, threatening to break back in and fill his mind with outright despair. Another night on his own, another 24 hours his dad would have to survive without his medication. And what if they'd somehow missed each other and his dad made it back to Bill Gates? Kobe hadn't even left a note. How dumb was that? Don't worry about things you can't change. He heard his dad's voice, kind and calm, and it soothed his worries. Still, the idea of sleeping in the hospital among the dead freaked Kobe out. He headed back upstairs, this time to the fourth floor, looking for somewhere to bed down in peace. At first, it seemed like most of the floor was operating rooms and offices and a couple labs filled with scanning equipment. There was less vegetation than on the other floors, and there wasn't a single body. From the window at the back of the waiting room, where puzzle books and magazines sat curling in a stack, Kobe caught a glimpse of the sun setting over the forested Seattle skyline. In the distance, rising taller than anything else around, was the disc-shaped summit of the Space Needle. His dad said it used to be an observation tower with thousands of tourists taking the elevator to the top every day. After the outbreak, the military have commandeered it to launch the Snatchers, and after each patrol, the seizure drones would return to it like birds to a roost. Kobe saw them now, black shapes circling like vultures. He considered settling into one of the chairs to sleep, but they looked like a heck of a lot less comfortable than his makeshift cot back in the school gym. He decided to try the top floor instead and took the final flight of stairs. At the top, the moss covered door had been pushed off its hinges by thick vines streaming through an air vent. He stepped over it. Some sort of transparent plastic curtain hung from the ceiling a few yards up the corridor, fixed to the walls on either side to provide a barrier. Everything beyond was blurred, and a sign above read, "Quarantine Zone. Biohazard suits must be worn beyond this point." Kobe walked toward it. There was a door to the left, and inside he saw the suits themselves hanging on pegs. White overalls with integral hoods and visors. Something about them hanging there, like weird second skins, made him shudder. But he found a pair of sneakers roughly the right size and changed into them. Next, he turned his attention back to the sealed area. He unzipped the plastic and stepped through. What he found inside wasn't at all what he had expected. The walls were pristine white, no plant life whatsoever. The air tasted warmer and stale. That at least made sense if this was a waste-free zone. He found himself looking into some sort of medical lab area filled with computer stations, large dark-screened digital displays, and desks littered with papers. He saw models of molecules that look a bit like those in the science rooms back at Bill Gates, plus chambers that resembled futuristic coffins. There were shelves filled with lab equipment and what may have been medications. One wall was entirely covered by something like a school whiteboard, but 10 times the size. Fixed to it were photos of individuals, plus close ups of anatomy Kobe couldn't fathom. Long equations had been scrawled down one side. They were trying to figure out how to treat the effects of the waste. I wonder if Dad knows about this place. Through glass partitions at the back of the room was another ward, with 6 beds, each surrounded by an array of complex monitoring tech. None of the beds, Kobe was pleased to see, were occupied. His stomach didn't feel great, and he wasn't sure if it was the odd dinner he'd eaten or just the anxiety chewing at him. This place looked safe, that was the main thing. In the ward, he shut the door and pushed one of the beds up against it, just in case. Then he settled onto another, pulled a sheet over him, and tried to ignore all the weird equipment. Tomorrow, I'll keep looking. At first light, he'd leave the hospital and continue toward the labs, and this time, he'd be a lot more careful. "I'm not quitting, Dad," he said to the white ceiling. And despite thinking that he'd never be able to sleep, it took only a minute before he drifted off. Kobe lay on the bench, gripping the bar above. Chalk dusted his palms. His dad stood over him, watching with a frown. "Just don't hurt yourself, son." "I won't," said Kobe. He took a deep breath in, then pushed. His pectoral muscles contracted, and he eased the bar off its hooks. His arms straightened, elbows locking. His dad had his hands ready in case he dropped the weight, but Kobe sucked in another breath as he lowered the bar to his chest. Another breath out, and he lifted again. His arms were shaking as he slotted the bar back into the hooks. He sat up. "Kobe, that was 300 pounds, said his dad, shaking his head. "Most full-grown men couldn't press that." "I think I could lift more," said Kobe, flushing with pride. "Let's put another 20 on." His dad was making a note on a clipboard. "Not today," he said. "You're making amazing progress, but I don't want you to push too hard without knowing what's going on with your physiology. Have you taken your vitamin supplements today?" "Of course," said Kobe. He stared into his dad's eyes. "We know what's going on with me. It's waste." His dad nodded. "Seems to be." He looked worried. "What's wrong?" His dad set down the clipboard and laid a hand on Kobe's shoulder. "We already know your body can handle the contamination, and we know it's made you stronger and faster than a normal kid. But knowing isn't the same as understanding it. I need more blood for the lab tests." "Sure," said Kobe. He stretched out his arm and his dad opened a clean syringe. Kobe turned away. "Even after all this time, you still don't like it, huh?" Kobe nodded, closing his eyes. His dad took blood every few days to monitor changes. He'd done it 1,000 times, but there was something about seeing the needle go in. But it didn't. And when he tried to lift his arms, there were leather straps over his wrists pinning him down. His head was held in place by something out of sight. He strained his neck but couldn't move at all. He wasn't on the bench anymore, but a gurney. Dad, what's happening? But his dad had gone too, and the gym. A hooded figure in a white suit leaned over him, then another, their faces hidden behind shining visors. Kobe tried to kick with his legs, but they were strapped down as well. He tried to scream, but there was something down his throat. He couldn't breathe. One of the scientists stooped lower, and in his hand, Kobe saw a gleaming scalpel. No, please! Don't be afraid, said a boy's voice. But he was afraid. He was terrified. The scalpel neared his face, and behind the mask he saw the scientist's cold, dispassionate eyes. Oh God, oh God, oh God. He felt the cold steel touch his skin, then the edge pressed down, biting. Kobe opened his eyes to a semi-darkness and saw the shadows of the hospital ward. He wasn't sure, but he wondered if his ears were picking up the dying notes of a wolf's howl. He glanced around. Alone. No scientist, no scalpel. Of course not. Everyone's gone. His head throbbed. It wasn't like a normal headache. It felt like the inside of his skull prickled with something like a static charge, and the backs of his eyes felt hot and heavy. He threw off the blanket, breathing hard, then remembered where he was, the quarantine zone on the 5th floor of the SODO Medical Center. He'd never spent a night out of the school, and maybe he was feeling the effects. Should have taken those vitamins, he thought wearily. He reached for the flashlight on the cabinet and flicked it on. Something had changed. It took him a few minutes to realize what it was. Green threads of moss laced the inside of the door, and a few shoots were coming up from the mattress, even the one he sat on. He'd forgotten to zip the hatch behind him. Waste spores must have found their way in. It never took this long. Didn't matter, though. He wasn't staying. Kobe crossed the room toward the window and looked out over the dark city. Still night, but what time was it? He wondered whether the wolf was really out there waiting or if that howl had been part of the dream too. He killed the flashlight and stared, letting his eyes adjust as the sweat dried on his skin. What the heck was the dream about anyway? The stuff with his dad was just a memory, but what about the second part? The doctors or scientists or whatever they were? The voice that sounded like a boy's? Some nightmare brought about by seeing the biohazard suits, maybe. There was no way he could go back to sleep now. He saw something outside, an arc of light shining in the darkness across the roof of a building a block away. Kobe's whole body seemed to seize up, heart thudding, the unease from the dream immediately swept away by a roaring hope. Dad, he said, his breath clouding the window. In a moment, his excitement melted into fear. Why is he on the roof? The snatchers will... Another flashlight joined the first, then a third. Kobe gasped and pressed his hands against the glass. Impossible! The lights vanished, but Kobe knew he hadn't imagined it. The flashlights, the way they'd moved, it could only mean one thing. People. Actual living people. Kobe's insides felt like they were being squeezed. His dad was certain that everyone in America had been wiped out, and if other survivors existed, that they were out of reach. Trying to find them was a lost cause. Kobe had never thought his father could be wrong about anything, but he was entirely wrong. Kobe tried to control himself, think rationally. If his dad were here, he would tell Kobe to be wary, stick to the rules. But what if these people could help Kobe find him? Without another thought, Kobe grabbed the utility belt resting on the floor, fastened it hurriedly. He threw the crossbow over his shoulder and with shaking hands unfolded the map, trying to work out which building the flashlights had been coming from. Then he ran for the door. I'm coming, Dad.